All right, so let me continue. He's a Korean national who has taught in the Faculty of Economics of Cambridge since 1990. In addition to numerous articles in academic journals, he has authored and co-authored 9 books and edited or co-edited 8 books in economics. His writing has been translated into 16 different languages, and he's a winner of the 2003 Myrdal Prize and the 2005 Leontiev Prize in Economics. Apart from his academic activities, Ha-Joon Chang has worked as a consultant for numerous international organizations, including various UN agencies, the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. He has also worked as a consultant for the governments of the UK, Canada, Japan, South Africa and Venezuela. Please welcome Professor Chang.
Thank you. You know, when I was a little kid, my favorite book was the Moomin stories. So I'm really glad to be in the land of Moomins. Well, I have been to this country quite a few times, but that was all in connection with the wider. And I mean, it's my first time to address predominantly Finnish audience, so the pleasure is even greater. Let me start this with a little story. 22 years ago, I went to England as a new graduate student, and I made a friend with this guy from Sweden. My friend, the Swedish friend, said he was a liberal, and he was terribly worried about the socialists ruining his beloved country by imposing excessive taxes. At that time, all I knew about Sweden was Pippi Longstocking, so I had no reason to dispute his judgment. So I asked him, so what do you think that you should do? And he said, that we should lower our tax burden. So I said, okay, that's how? And he said, at the moment we are paying something like 55% of the GDP as tax. We should lower it to 50%. Now, left-wing people in many other countries would sell their grandmother to have liberals that think 50% tax burden is okay. But this story illustrates that there are huge differences across countries in terms of what their governments do, and more importantly, in terms of their views on what is the appropriate role of the government. Now, when I say something like that, many people come back and ask, well, you say that, but isn't it the case that there's economic theory that says the smaller the government is and the less it does, it is better? Now, that's what most professional economists will tell you. But actually, this is not true. To begin with, there are many different economic theories. The theory that says the smaller the government is, the better it is only one of many theories. And there are many different kinds of economic theory. Even within the mainstream neoclassical theory, there is the welfare economic school and the neoliberal school. And the welfare economists will be quite happy to allow lots of the active role for the government. And then there's the Keynesian school and institutionalist school and many different economic theories. And given what is going on in the world today, probably theories other than neoliberal theories are likely to be more popular. Now, even for the same theory, what is correct role for the government depends on the country's values and goals. for example, in Scandinavia, people care a lot about the environment. And there's nothing in economic theory, whatever theory you take, which says that people shouldn't have that kind of goal. And once you move beyond the sort of market-state dichotomy and begin to consider other forms of organizing collective human activities, such as corporations, cooperatives, networks, and so on, the picture becomes even more complex. I mean, some roles that in some countries the public sector performs is performed by, say, cooperatives or what is known as the third sector. I mean, for example, when you read about, say, Singapore in, say, the Economist magazine or the Wall Street Journal, you will only hear about this free trade policy and welcoming attitude towards foreign investment. These are all true, but you will probably not be told that 22% of Singapore's GDP is produced by public-owned enterprises. The government owns almost all the land and supplies 85% of housing through public housing corporation. So in different countries, you have a very different distribution of the activities across different sectors. But today, I think I want to focus on another dimension, which is that the role of the government changes over time. Well, first of all, as a background, I would like to point out that many countries have done well despite or even because of going against, well, today's or yesterday's prevailing economic theories. For example, the United States, despite having the highest tariff in the world, the United States was the fastest growing economy in the late 19th and early 20th century. It also heavily regulated foreign investment in many sectors, especially banking. It wasn't just Finland who did that. I mean, today American investors come to Scandinavia and complain that different classes of shares have different voting rights. But in the 19th century, when it came to banks, the American government didn't even allow foreign shareholders to vote in a shareholders meeting. So you could draw dividend, but have no say in the management of the company. Also, if you measure it by the share of government funding in total research and development, the United States has been the most interventionist country in the world during the post-Second World War period. Until the sort of mid-90s, especially because the United States government spends a lot of money on defense-related research, something like between 50 and 70% of total R&D spending in the United States was funded by the government. It has come down recently to around 40%, but this is still higher than the European countries, which have only about 30% and more than double what you have in Japan, where it is around 20%. And when you think about it, most of the areas in which the U.S. economy has technological advantage are sectors developed mainly, although not exclusively, in relation to defense research with public funding. The computer was the first developed for the U.S. Army. Semiconductor was basically developed with U.S. Navy funding. The internet was also part of this defense development, and radar, microwave, you name it. I mean, just about everything in addition to research in health and bioengineering, which was mainly funded by the National Institute of Health. So, actually, despite what most people believe, the U.S. economy, the government in the U.S. the economy plays a very important role. Another example is Finland. According to today's prevailing theory, it was a big mistake for the Nokia group to subsidize the loss-making electronics division for 17 years. And it was wrong for the Finnish government to support that effort through its procurement policy. Can you imagine? I mean, in the presence of Mikko, so probably, you should forgive me for talking about Nokia. I mean, I feel like, lecturing philosophy in front of Aristotle or something. But, the Nokia electronics division was set up in 1960, and the first year it made profit was 1977. And can you imagine someone like Mikko turning up in the New York Stock Exchange in 1970 and telling the investors, look, we have this company which hasn't made any money for the last 10 years, and we don't expect to make money for another 7 years. But if you believe in us and invest in us, in 30 years' time, we'll give you the best company in the world. I don't think anyone would have invested money in that company. We all know that Finland had draconian regulation on foreign investment, classifying all firms with more than 20% foreign ownership as dangerous enterprises until the 1980s. And today, despite having one of the biggest governments measured in terms of tax burden, in per capita terms, Finland has been the fastest growing OECD economy since 1990, and this is despite that huge shock you had in the late 80s and early 90s due to the collapse of the Soviet Union. According to standard economic theory, Finland should be in ruins. Companies that are making losses for 17 years and one of the highest tax burdens in the world and completely keeping out foreign investors. But here you go. You have one of the best economies in the world. Now, the examples can go on, but the interesting thing is that not just the US and Finland, but most of today's rich countries actually have done things against the prevailing free market orthodoxies of today. So basically the lesson is that you shouldn't believe that there's some kind of correct theory that everyone should follow, because no one has. Now, the desirable role of the government not only differs across countries, but should and does change over time. Now, this is partly because what I call policy cycles. It's that inherent human tendency to adopt something and then take it to the extreme. And then there are problems, so you pull back from it and move to the other side, and you do the same with the new idea. So in the 19th century, you had this view of the laissez-faire, that the government shouldn't intervene in anything. Well, although in practice, a lot of countries did intervene in many things, that was at least the prevailing ideology, and at least in terms of macroeconomic and financial policies, it was really the case that the governments didn't do much, and that made the Great Depression a lot worse than what it could have been, and then that prompted people to shift to Keynesianism after Second World War. But then that developed its own problems. So after the so-called stagflation of the 1970s, many countries abandoned it and moved to neoliberal ideas. And the recent turmoil in the world economy has made people realize that neoliberal ideas have gone too far. And there's an increasing consensus that there should be tougher regulation on financial markets, although exactly what will come out of this is still unclear, not least because we don't know the scale of the problem yet. Now, in addition to these the policy cycles, there are also changes in the role of the government that is made necessary by long-term structural changes. I mean, we can talk about issues like global warming, increasing complexity. I'll talk about this in detail in a few minutes. Globalization of corporations, rise of new countries, graying of the population, and so on. And these are some of the issues that I think are particularly relevant for Finland. I mean, these could be, different for other countries. So I deliberately selected the issues that are relevant for Finland or countries like Finland. Well, let's look at them one by one. Global warming. Well, certainly the progress in global warming is making it increasingly necessary for governments to dictate more strictly how we produce things, what we consume, where we live, how we travel to work, and where we go for holidays. It's no accident that the Americans consume so much energy because they basically decided to live in the suburbs, don't have much public transport, so everyone drives. Now, in European cities, it's usually the opposite. I mean, they live in a more compact space, public transport is developed, so the people use much less cars, which means that if the Americans are going to change their energy consumption pattern, there'll have to be a major redesign of their urban spaces and transportation system. I don't know whether they'll do it or not, but that's the implication, and this probably means the government basically changing radically people's incentive in terms of having this American dream of living in this nice house in the suburb with big lawn and so on, and the people may have to begin to live in apartment blocks. Also, the global warming is posing an even greater challenge because the problem is truly global, and we all need to sit together and work out a way to equitably distribute the burden of adjustments while allowing poor countries grow with minimum possible impact on global warming. This is a very difficult issue. I've met some people who argue that India and China should stop developing because if they develop at this speed, we will all die together. Well, which probably is true, but how do you justify that? That there are still literally more than 1 billion people in India and China who do not have more than $1 a day, and we cannot tell those people to live in that kind of poverty because we might all die together. So, what are we going to do? Are we going to transfer cleaner technology to these countries? It might also mean that people in richer countries are changing their consumption patterns because, one reason why China's been producing so much greenhouse gas in the last at least decade or decade and a half is because they are making all those things that people in America and Europe buy. So it's not for their own consumption, so the cutting down greenhouse gases might mean that we will not have $3 T-shirts anymore. It's a choice that we have to make, and in all this, the public sector at the global level needs to be involved. Now, the second issue is the issue of growing complexity. With the technological and other developments, the Finnish economy and its environment is becoming more and more complex. Now, this observation is often used as an argument against government intervention in mature economies. There are people who argue that, yes, if you are very poor, centralized direction that probably works because the economy is simple. So I mean, you have only one kind of shoes, and I mean, sort of the 1930s Soviet kind of model. Whereas if your economy becomes complex, then the central direction is useless. Huh? Now, this is to an extent true. Other things being equal, central direction will be more difficult in a more complex economy. But the trouble is that other things are not equal. With economic development, the economy may become more complex, but the government's capabilities to organize and manage increase as well. I mean, if you go to poor countries, even collecting taxes is a major challenge for them because they have probably 3 guys sitting in the tax bureau and no inspectors, no money, nothing. So with economic development, your ability to manage and organize also increase. So I wouldn't say that in complex economies you cannot really manage that centrally. But having said that, I think it is true that a more complex economy is more difficult to manage. Now, what does it mean for the role of the government? Well, first of all, I think this means that the government needs to withdraw from some existing policy areas in order to redeploy its human and financial resources in areas whose importance is increasing. Now, in a complex world, there's a huge amount of uncertainty. It's not, I mean, this concept of uncertainty should be differentiated from this concept of risk, which is a calculable thing. Uncertainty is something that you cannot calculate. I mean, this notion was developed by economists like John Maynard Keynes, the American economist Frank Knight, and so on. But I think the person who said this in the most accessible and memorable way is Donald Rumsfeld, the former defense secretary of the United States. Rumsfeld once said, there are things that we know, and there are things that we don't know. But there are also things that we don't know that we don't know. So this is the kind of the problem that you don't even realize that it exists. I mean, the best example is the global warming. I mean, even like 10 years ago, I mean, it wasn't a real major issue except in very small green circles. Now everyone's accepting it, and this means that many countries are actually finding it difficult to redeploy their resources to deal with this problem, unless you are Scandinavia or California that have thought about this for a long time. So, I mean, this resource redeployment issue is not simple because, you know that you have to redeploy, but where to redeploy is quite unclear. So if you see it from this perspective, you would agree that in a complex and changing world, what is important is not the competence in particular areas, as you really don't know where your next big job will be, but the ability to spot new trends, think strategically and independently, and rapidly redeploy your resources. And in organizational terms, I think this means routinizing or regularizing as many things as possible so that our limited mental resources are released for creative strategic thinking. I think it was Albert Einstein who once famously said that, no, maybe it wasn't Einstein, it was one of the famous physicists who famously said that the best ideas come when you are slightly unemployed. Yeah? Because if you are tied up in routine things, you just don't have time to think. And you can actually, I mean, I'm not an expert in that area, but you can actually link it with all this work on artificial intelligence and decision-making developed by people like Herbert Simon, the Nobel Economics Prize winner, who also worked in physics, political science, public administration, and business administration, as well as artificial intelligence. And one observation that Simon made was, in order to design artificial intelligence, he studied the chess quite a lot. And he realized that actually when you look at the best chess players, they don't actually consider all the options. The way they do it is they recognize a pattern and they immediately narrow the strategic options and then very carefully look at them. Whereas the novices, I mean, they think about everything and nothing comes out because, their brains are log jammed. I mean, that's just one insight, but I think that this has a huge implication for the way we design our institutions and assigning tasks. And I'm sure that Don Tapscott will have a lot more interesting things to say about this than I can. Increasing complexity also has political implications, if you like. Because increasing complexity means that government needs to rely more heavily on outside expert opinions, which often are largely provided by those who also have direct interest in the policy in question. So this makes it easier for interest groups to manipulate the government. So when you are trying to regulate, I don't know, the drugs industry, a lot of knowledge about the drugs actually come from the industry. So how do you know that this is an objective information or not? No? The only way to reduce this the danger is that the process of government intervention is made more transparent so that competing views can be openly debated. Because the other option is not to rely on outside expertise, which is just silly. Greater transparency and greater debate will also improve the quality of the decisions, as debates often sharpen the focus and introduce new perspectives. Of course, this will slow things down. I mean, if you have one dictator that tells you what to do, decisions will be made very, very quickly, but this delay may be a price to pay if you want decisions that are impartial and of higher quality. Okay, then next oops, sorry, I forgot that. We move to the issue of globalization of Finnish business. Now, more and more production activities by Finnish firms are conducted outside Finland. Now, in the short run, this reduces jobs in Finland. I mean, there's no question about that. Although in the long run, the impact is unclear. I mean, I don't know. I mean, don't have any empirical evidence to say it went the other way, or this way or the other way. But in theory, at least, if investing abroad allows Finnish firms to grow faster, and if they bring enough money back home and invest in other things, Finnish companies investing abroad can create more and better paid jobs in Finland. Huh? Now, whether this is happening or not, I don't know. Huh? So, I mean, you have this short-term, long-term trade-off. Moreover, sorry, where is it? Moreover, globalization of the Finnish business means that when the Finnish government supports Finnish firms, a lot of the resources that are spent for the support will leak out to foreign countries. Now, this raises the political question. How much leakage is acceptable to the taxpayers? Eh? Also, globalized Finnish firms will become less attached to Finland. You know, I do not believe for a minute that capital has no nationality. Eh? And this is a misconception. All firms have nationalities, even in this age of globalization. But it is also true that the weakening commitment of major Finnish firms to Finland may reduce their willingness to accept egalitarian policies of large welfare state and higher wages. So there's a political problem to deal with. And then we need to think about the changing world economic and political maps. You know, new economic powers like China and India are rising, while Russia is rebuilding itself. Well, the rise of Russia certainly would worry Finland, given its history. And as a Korean, I fully understand this problem. I mean, you know, we were officially colonized only for about 100 years, around 70 years by the Mongols in the 13th century and 35 years by the Japanese between 1910 and 1945. So that's nothing compared to what you guys had, 7 centuries of the Swedish and Russian colonialism. But we also have suffered a lot from, well, just about everyone you can think of, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Mongols, the Huns, the Manchurians, the Russians, the Americans, you name it. I mean, I still remember one of our school textbooks, history textbooks that used to start by saying, in 2,000 something years of known history, we have been invaded. I mean, I forget the exact number, but it was something like 1,455 times or something like that. Yeah? And we are still here. Yeah? So we very much share that kind of outlook with you. But I mean, fortunately, in the case of Russia, I think your EU membership will provide substantial protection. So probably the greater worry is the rise of countries like China and India. Now, at the moment, these countries do not compete directly very much with Finland. And at the moment, Finland is actually benefiting from these countries opening up and growing because we have a bigger market, we have new production locations, and so on. But soon they are going to start competing with Finland in high-tech industries. And this will happen well before their overall wage levels reach the Finnish level. You know, I mean, I said there are more than billion people that are living in these countries at less than $1 a day. But at the same time, these countries can build nuclear bombs. You know, the Chinese just sent men into space. You know? They build nuclear reactors. Huh? So soon they'll reach the level of technology where it will start competing with countries like Finland in high-tech businesses. Huh? And if Finland is going to survive this competition, the only way is to accelerate innovation, as the other alternative is to accept lower wages and inferior welfare entitlements. And given the increasingly costly nature of innovation these days, the Finnish government will have to play an even more aggressive and inventive role in promoting innovation especially building on the success of the organizations like Sitra in engineering effective public-private partnership in innovation management. But let me tell you, I mean, it's a huge challenge still. You know, I don't know the Finnish numbers, but let's compare R&D spending in China and Korea. You know, as a proportion of GDP, China still spends about 1.2% in the R&D. Korea, I mean, it's not quite at the Finnish level, but that spends something like 3.2%. But in absolute terms, because China is so much bigger, the Chinese are already spending more money on R&D than Korea does. And Finland, I mean, Finnish income is probably something like 2.5 times the Korean income, but the population is only about 10%. So in absolute terms, already the Chinese are spending a lot more than you guys do. Despite the fact that Finland, as a proportion of the GDP, spends one of the highest amounts in the world. So because of this fixed cost problem of research and development, small countries are bound to have more disadvantages than large countries in the developing R&D. Of course, you'll have to solve it by being more innovative in organization and finding the niche and being more agile and so on. But you know, in terms of sheer amount of money, you are already behind China. Anyway, I had a few things to say about the graying of population, but I mean, I was told that this has been debated quite a lot here, so I'm not going to spend too much time. Let me just say one thing on this. You know, immigration is in the end a political decision. You know, purely in terms of the economic calculation, there is no reason why you cannot replace 90% of Finnish workforce with the Chinese and the Indians and Brazilians. You know, of course, that this is not going to happen, but just think about it. I mean, most people in Finland and other rich countries have a high living standard because they basically share a labor market with highly productive people. Take the case of, say, bus drivers. You know, probably a bus driver in Helsinki gets paid, I don't know, 50 times what a bus driver in Bombay gets paid. But is it because he's a better bus driver? No, probably it's the opposite. If you want to be a bus driver in India, you have to be very skillful because there'll be the cows and the children and the rickshaws and God knows what to maneuver against. Whereas in Helsinki, well, if you know more or less how to drive straight, you can drive a bus. So when you think it in those terms, yes, I mean, why not replace 90% of the Finnish workforce with the Chinese and the Indians? Well, of course, you wouldn't do that because, you know, Finland is not a corporation, it's a country, it's a nation. And you have your identity, you have your culture, so you wouldn't do that. But, I mean, this shows that very often economic arguments in relation to immigration really is a secondary matter, because the most important thing is the political decision whether you want to have a totally different country. What does it mean to be a Finn? Anyway, so far we have talked about some long-term trends which I think are relevant for Finland and discuss what they mean for the role of the government in Finland. Let me conclude with 2 words of warning. Well, it's more than 2 words. I mean, it's quite a sizable portion, but 2 points of warning, I should say. First of all, in judging trends of long-term nature, we should avoid the usual human tendency to think that the most exciting change is necessarily the most important change. You know, today we are all very excited about the internet and so on. And a lot of people say, oh, well, that we have this progress in globalization because of the internet. But actually, it's not clear to me whether the present-day revolution in communications represented by the internet is actually more revolutionary than the communication revolution of the late 19th century that was brought about by the telegraph. You know, before the telegraph, if you wanted to send a message from London to New York, it took at least 3-4 weeks. And there was a distinct danger that the message may not reach the other shore because the ships sank and so on. With the telegraph, you reduced it to, say, 15 minutes. Yeah? I mean, the time to arrange all this and so on. Internet reduced the time taken for this transfer from, say, 3 to 4 minutes if you use, say, telephone or fax, to 3 to 4 seconds. So this means that the telegraph implies a reduction by 1,500 to 2,000 times in transmission time, whereas the internet implies only a reduction by 60 times. Now, I'm not saying that the internet is not revolutionary. I mean, you know, in the old days, yeah, you couldn't send pictures, you couldn't send sound. Yeah? I mean, now you can. Yeah? And then internet does not need trained operators in the same way in which telegraph did, and so on. So, yeah, I don't want to say that this is nothing, but in terms of the sheer reduction in time required in transmitting messages, actually there's no competition between telegraph and the internet. The former wins hands down. For another example, I'm sorry I keep getting at the internet, but I have nothing against the internet. But just to put things into perspective, 5 minutes, yeah, sure, yeah. At least so far, the impacts of the internet may not have been as big as those of washing machines and other household appliances. Washing machines and household appliances have completely transformed our work and family lives and also gender relationship, more importantly, by hugely reducing the burden of women in terms of household work and enabling them to enter the labor market. Internet so far hasn't had that kind of that transformative effect. It may in the future. These examples show that when you are trying to judge the impacts of newly emerging trends, you should be careful not to think that you are living in a uniquely revolutionary world and try to put things into perspective. The second word of warning is that when looking into the future, you must not assume that all current trends are going to continue, however strong they may seem. For example, in the early 20th century, many people predicted that British population will decline by the 1970s, given the birth rate trends at the time. Of course, this didn't happen because of the baby boom, increased immigration, and so on. But, you know, this is one example to show that the future is difficult to predict. Globalization, we think it's going, well, at least I have been thinking that it's going to continue forever. But, you know, given today's climate, some aspects, especially the financial globalization, will be reversed. Globalization has already been reversed once before, after the Great Depression. Now, you may think, oh, well, I mean, if you get the trend wrong, does it really matter? It's an academic question, isn't it? No, it's not. I mean, look at Iceland. I mean, this country banged everything on the assumption that the trend in global financial globalization will continue, and then now is suffering terribly from the consequences. So it's very important to read these trends correctly. For yet another example, I think China and India is likely to keep growing in the foreseeable future, but I wouldn't be 100% sure. I mean, if they do not manage the increasing inequality problems well, their societies are going to have an implosion. I mean, there are already riots in parts of China due to factory closure coming from this financial crisis. I mean, we just saw this news that there's a major terrorist attack in Bombay in India. Tens of thousands of farmers are committing suicide in India because they had failed in commercial farming ventures and so on. So, I mean, these, while it lifted a lot of people above poverty, it have created a lot of losers. And even though the governments there are trying to do something about this, finally, it's not clear whether they'll necessarily do these things in time. So, to conclude, there is no single correct set of roles of the government. More importantly, the role of the government needs to change over time. Well, sometimes it changes because of policy cycles, but other times it needs to change because changes in long-term trends. But we should not assume that the most visible or prominent trends are the most important ones necessarily. Know that we should assume that today's trends will continue forever. And all this means that intelligent governments need long-term vision, pragmatism, and a healthy dose of skepticism, and should not believe that everything will always be the same, nor should it believe that whatever prevailing orthodoxy is necessarily correct. I mean, of course, I mean, I don't need to say that in Finland. I mean, this country has succeeded by not slavishly listening to other people, but, I mean, just to emphasize this point, I said that. Thank you very much.